Szanowni Państwo, mamy w tej części naszej sesji.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have 4 papers to be delivered in this panel, 2 from the Polish professors, Polish colleagues, and 2 to be delivered by our Russian colleagues. I don't think I need to introduce the speakers too much, but we are going to be focusing on the reception of revolutionary developments in Russia in Europe, European reaction to the developments of 1917. Professor Andrzej Nowak will speak as first, Revolution and Geopolitics. Very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this important conference. Now, my topic, in a way, breaks away from the main theme, although I believe some of the motifs will be useful. I want to talk about the link between geopolitics and the origin of the revolution and the process of the revolution. I would like to look at the problem through Lenin. Well, before Lenin became Lenin, in the first issue of Iskra, December the 24th, 1901, Włodzimierz Ilyich Ulyanov wrote his first article there on geopolitics. And to be specific, he offered sharp criticism of the superpowers' intervention against Boxers' uprising in China. Now, this is a motto for what will follow in my speech. The idea of the revolution in Russia, which can be identified with Lenin, originated in coincidence with the concept of geopolitics. In 1879, the concept was first used by Rudolf Kjellén. I think that's how you pronounce the Swedish name Kjellén, in his article about the borders of Sweden, and then it was expounded in 1901 in a broader text entitled Politics as Science. The idea became quickly popularized, especially in the Germanic world, in which Vladimir Lenin participated. He spoke German nearly as well as he spoke Russian. Again, I do not want to preoccupy you too much with the definitions. Kjellén himself introduced his definition as science about the state in space. So, geopolitics and revolution. Important is the context where the two phenomena come up, and a common denominator, and that is looking for conflict areas in space. This is how I see geopolitics at a time of its birth. Lenin was looking very intensely for conflict areas, conflict points in which the idea of the revolution could get the upper hand. Of course, most important in these days were internal issues. Russia, internal issues. Global politics, the Chinese issue, the one I mentioned a moment ago, came up only incidentally. However, they would later gain momentum because of the global context at the time, which is best reflected by one of the most important texts in geopolitical thought. Hartmut Mackinder, a British geographer, delivered in January in Royal Geographical Society, the geographical pivot of history. No, and here you'll find all the key concepts of heartland and a semi-crescent which surrounds Eurasian heartland, which is Russia. But the essence of Mackinder's speech was that at the beginning of the 20th century, the age of Columbus came to an end. There is no more land to conquer. Everything has been discovered, divvied up by the empires, so what remains is conflict about what's there to be taken. Therefore, empires have no other choice but to fight for what is already attributed, what is already occupied in a social realm, as was the case with Lenin. In social realm, it is the oppressors who occupy the position that should be taken by the oppressed. Now, Lenin did not have a chance to listen to Mackinder in London, although he may have a chance to have read that because he would frequent the British Museum Library, and the speech was published in a very important publication at the time. Prince Kropotkin could have been present. He was member of the Royal Geographical Society, but it is not Kropotkin I want to talk about. In 1904, the Bolshevik Party is already in place, and the opportunities for the party to act come up with the first revolution, and Lenin understood that perfectly well. That was the Russian-Japanese War, the first real practical source of the 1904 revolution. Lenin noticed that, although he was engaged in revolutionary work in Russia, he was not preoccupied with geopolitics in 1905, 6, or 7. So after the failure, after the defeat, the Russian elites tried to rebuild the vision of liberalizing empire, the Stolpin reform underway, a hopeful development, cadets, Piotr Struve, brother-in-arms of Lenin. Well, the hope was that a correction would be introduced in the division of the world between the empires to the benefit of Russia in collaboration with Anglo-Saxon countries, Great Britain, United States, and France as an ally. France was weaker at the time. And, of course, at the expense and against Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Turkey. So a correction, a geopolitical correction, in which Russia will stand next to neoliberal powers. So this is the idea behind Russian neoliberals after 1907. Well, I should also tell you that in the very rich Russian political thought of the time, there were concepts of conflict between Russia and Anglo-Saxon countries. Andrzej Sneseryov, for example, who in 1906 published his important text, India as an important factor in mid-Asian issues. Or, the most interesting, I believe, geopolitical project at the time, Alexei Yedrichin's he signed his text under the nickname of Van Damme, where he presents the political system of the world at that time as a conflict between Russia and Anglo-Saxon countries. United States that deprived Russia of Alaska, then they took over Hawaii, will infiltrate China, and will flank Russia from the south and the east, according to Alfred Machen concept. So Yadrichin believed that the 20th century will develop under the banner of conflict between Russia and Anglo-Saxon countries. 160 million Russians against 160 million Anglo-Saxons. Now, how does that relate to Lenin and the revolution? Now, Lenin keeps looking for, after the defeat of the first revolution, he keeps looking for new conflict areas which would trigger off revolutionary dynamic in Russia. In 1910, he revisits the geopolitical topics. Well, there are a number of articles written at the time about China, but the most important tool for Lenin in his struggle is the national issue. This is exactly what Lenin devotes most of his attention to make the nationalist issue the tool in the hands of revolution. Now, a lot has been written by him, and a lot of actions were taken by Lenin, building contacts and so on, with this view, with this in mind. Then there is war breaking out in 1914, well, we all know it. We know Lenin's program, which was formulated in his Swiss period, to convert imperialist war into revolution. However, we must not forget about the fact that at the end of 1916, Lenin lost hope there. We forget that history has its own dynamic, and we kind of project what happened before. But end of 1916, Lenin started to assume that this war may end up in an imperialistic peace, that there would be no revolution, as he'd expected earlier. End of 1916, early 1917, there's a whole range of peace initiatives, some operated secretly, some above board. Then there is a personal tragedy. Lenin's mother dies, which was a trauma to him. There's a quote by Lenin, that's January 1917, in Zurich, where Lenin said that we old will not live to see the decisive battles of the revolution. That's January 1917. 2 months later, he was on his way to Petersburg. But then, where did Lenin look for hope in this difficult time? Difficult time for the revolutionary idea based on conflict. Well, at that time, Lenin construed his concepts of ongoing war after the end of the World War. Yes, there may be a compromise peace, as Lenin feared. He published a number of interesting texts. The war program of the Proletarian Revolution, that's this September 1906, where he said that socialists are not against wars. There will be more war, nationalist, revolutionary, progressive wars, wars by China, India or Persia against superpowers. This is where the area of new conflict should be looked for. This is where a new scenario for the revolution can be written. Only after we dispossess bourgeoisie worldwide, and not just in one country, wars will become impossible, he said. Now, in this text, it was for the first time that Lenin presented his comprehensive vision of building socialism in one country. and the consequences of it. If socialism develops in one country, it didn't have to be Russia, Lenin thought, then wars will not only be possible, but indeed necessary, because the world will be divided up into two ideological camps. However, the most important text in which Lenin wanted to conjoin revolutionary program and geopolitics was his most mature work of all theoretical works that he'd written, Imperialism as the highest stadium of capitalism. Now, chief inspiration for Lenin was not geopolitics, not Cielen or Mackinder, but John Hobson, a British economist whose book Imperialism was issued in 1800 based on the Boer Wars, presented exactly what Lenin wanted to see, the vision of the world in which conflicts based on clash of capital is a must, is inevitable. There will be no concord of capital. There will be ongoing competition for the markets, for labor force, and therefore there will be another chance for a new revolution to grow. It's a 200-page text that he wrote in 1916. Hobson is the focus. Karl Kautsky was his chief opponent, German social democracy ideologist, who at that time built a vision of meta-imperial order after the war, when all the empires agree within a new order. No more conflict, Kautsky said. End of history. Of course, he did not use the end of history concept, but that was his vision. Now, Lenin was furious. There may not be end of history. There may not be end of conflict. Just the opposite. The conflict should continue, and we need to look for vital sources of it. So, the national issue. Hence his support for Belarusians, for the Poles, for Ukrainians. So, to demolish European stability. But the idea behind it was the clash between empires. Where would the fault line go? A quote, capitalism went beyond colonial system and the oppression of most of the world by a few leading states. The divvying up of spoils really happens between two or three looters. America, England, and Japan entangle the whole world into their wars, into the division of their own bounties. America, England, and Japan. These are the enemies, huge imperialistic empires that want to subjugate the world. And then only Russia and its revolution in 1917 can lead the rest of the world against the privileged few, against the privileged leaders. And that is the vision of Europe, Chapter 8, Parasites and the Rotting of Capitalism. Imperialism as the supreme form of capitalism. So here you find the vision of Europe as a Riviera of capitalists, where the riches of the whole world in the hands of the West is put at the disposal of this luxury old age house or entertainment house, which was Europe. Now, the vision where Russia can effect a revolution and lead the rest of the world against the winning imperialist superpowers, Western superpowers, it's important to say Western, may be a permanent vision of his, maybe a permanent feature of his vision of a revolution after the First World War. Of course, when the revolution broke out, not the one that Lenin was making, in March 1917, Lenin returned to his country to handle internal problems. But the inevitability of geopolitics really became a first practical lesson in geopolitics for Lenin. Germany became partners of Bolshevik Russia. Against whom? Against Great Britain, United States, Japan. So the superpowers that pose a threat to both Bolsheviks and Germans. I'm using the language of Lenin, socialist Germany. I'm using his language. And they and Lenin already presented his view of the global exploitation in a brochure in 1916. So there is a provisional agreement with Germany. Lenin becomes a revolutionary, and he uses the agreement with Germany to give him a break in fueling revolution in Russia as a prop, so to speak. Then the prop is no longer needed, and he reverts to the geopolitical agenda. From Russia, a revolutionary front spreads all over Europe and then all over the world. And this charge is put in place in October 1918. The Western Front is really prepared. Communist governments are prepared for the countries to be liberated by the Soviet army, but this all comes to a halt for three reasons. One, the home war in Russia breaks out. Two, Poland becomes a roadblock. And three, very importantly, an internal coup in Germany takes place, and Róża, Luxemburg, Liebknecht are murdered, and that was a major, it was a stab really in the concept of the pan-European revolution. So there's a need for geopolitical game. What kind of game can it be? There are two scenarios in addition to the general scenario of a universal revolution. One is agreement with Germany. Germany lost the war. They are now on the oppressed side after the Versailles agreement. And it doesn't really have to be a revolutionary Germany. It can be Germany as is, a Weimar Republic, conservative Germany, any Germany that disagrees with the Versailles Treaty. We would, by doing that, divvy up the imperialist camp. But Lenin delineates yet another possibility in his brochure of 1916, and that is to use against the Western superpowers, which were doing quite well at the time, the anti-colonial movement, the full force of it. 1918, Joseph Stalin would write about that. Politburo at the time was 4 men strong. There was a 5th member on a technical side, but 4 most important people: Lenin, Kamenev, Trotsky, and Stalin. Stalin was very important at that time. He is not an invention of later years. The reason I'm saying this is to highlight the importance of Stalin's words in 1918. He wrote a few articles published in the Commissariat for Nationality. Do not forget about the East and the light from the East. That's November and December 1918. Now, in Stalin's vision, you read the following: for imperialists, the riches of the East is important, but also subservient human material. We must break this dream of enslaved nations. We must infect proletariat and peasants with the spirit of revolution. That is the task for communism. So, according to Stalin, chief task for communism is to become leader of the anti-colonial movement against Great Britain, France, United States, i.e. those countries that cannot be conquered by means of a one revolutionary charge. Now, in August, Lev Davidovich Trotsky, who was stationed in Lubnie at the time, a former seat of the Vishniowiecki Principality. Now, he wants to move the line of attack not towards Europe, because the road to Europe is blocked off by two strong opponents, but that's what he wrote in August 1919 to his comrades. The road to Paris and London leads through Afghanistan, Punjab and Bengali because of the lack of success in the Western Front, the fall of Red Budapest, the weakening of the communist movement in Germany. For some time we must bid farewell to the revolution in Central Europe. For how long? Trotsky would not say. But a third scenario comes to light of how the revolution should progress. Not a global revolution going through Europe, not a tactical alliance with Germany against the treaties of Versailles, but revolutionary Russia as a leader of the exploited world. I understand I must bring my speech to a close. This idea comes back at a time when the attempt to storm Europe via Poland in 1920 falls flat. Of course, this is very interesting to Stalin, but it does not succeed in 1920, and Lenin, trying to stand up for the developments of August, September 1920, near Warsaw and on the Niemen River, Lenin said that thanks to this attempt, where the Red Army showed its strength, the exploited and oppressed nations of the world saw that if not now, then in the future they would be able to implement their most ambitious scenario, and that is the liberation of the whole world from the capitalist oppression. I'll finish by words of Lenin of October the 15th, that's Moscow speech. The Red Army proved that it can respond to strikes, but it was not strong enough to score a success in the first year or indeed the first month of the building of peace. But after the first month of peace building, there will come years, and with every year, the Red Army will be 10 times stronger. End of quote. And now my conclusion. Lenin believed that to build peace is to increase his army 10 times each year, and Stalin was the best pupil, a revolutionary pupil of Lenin. Thank you.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, over to Professor Evgeniy Sergeev from the State University of Moscow. Perception of the Russian Revolution of 1917 in Western Europe on the example of Britain.
This lecture aims at highlighting 4 principal points to better understand the impression caused by the Russian Revolution upon administrative officials and ordinary people in Britain after the collapse of the Tsardom in March and the provisional government in November 1917. So the main topics you may see on the screen. And the first problem I'd like to discuss is the alleged British involvement in the Russian Revolution. The revolutionary events of 1917 in Russia received a wide response from the British political circles of varying ideological coloration for a number of reasons. Firstly, due to the nature of the allied Russian-British relations as a part of the Entente Cordiale. Two cousins, you may see. Secondly, owing to the high importance of Russia's war effort, a so-called concept of steamroller, to win over the Central Powers. And finally, in the light of serious concerns shared by many leading English officials about the desire of the so-called pro-German party in Russia to conclude a separate peace with the Kaiser William II. Right after the March turmoil in Petrograd, I use, of course, the Gregorian style, the British subjects, either living in the UK or staying in Russia, felt bewildered and shocked with the speedy and almost bloodless downfall of autocracy in Russia. As one British journalist metaphorically described this common mood, the revolution came upon us, I quote, with a rock of the ground under our feet and the rumble of guns in our ears. Yet, there were few politicians or diplomats like Sir George Buchanan, the last British ambassador to the Russian Empire, who repeatedly warned Nicholas II about the unrest that was rife throughout the government, the Duma, and the entire country. You may see the British Embassy in Petrograd, the building of it. Similarly, Lord Alfred Milner, a prominent member of David Lloyd George's coalition cabinet, who headed the British delegation to the Petrograd Inter-Allied Conference in February 1917, mentioned a possibility of the plot against the Russian emperor during his 2 interviews with him, and it is widely known that the delegates at the Entente Conference had unanimously agreed to deploy a decisive attack against the Quadruple Alliance on all fronts, including the Russian one, with the view to end the First World War until the beginning of 1917. Yet, for political reasons, it would be impossible in Russia, at least until the end of the war. It was impossible for revolutionary forces in Russia, at least until the end of the war, to gain victory. It was a belief among the British politicians, widespread belief. Both British and Russian governmental papers, along with the private correspondence by many observers, clearly indicated non-involvement of British diplomats or CIS, Secret Intelligence Service officers, in the mass movement in Petrograd. And there is no evidence that there was any involvement on the side of the British, as I said, officials in the February Revolution. Later, the leading Petrograd newspaper, Izvestia, the News, pointed out, I quote, "In the early days of the revolution, a great change was seen by many people as a victory for the party of war. The adepts of these views argued that the British ambassador was nominated as one of its masterminds. However, neither by his look nor by his intentions was Sir George Buchanan responsible for the victory of freedom in Russia." And another quotation, which I'd like to present, is the opinion of Konstantin Globachev, then the head of the Petrograd Police Department, as participants of the Petrograd Inter-Allied Conference. So Konstantin Globachev, who said, "They say that England has helped our revolutionary center in the upheaval through its ambassador Buchanan. I argue that neither Buchanan nor British subjects have taken any active involvement in our revolutionary movement or in the abdication of the Tsar for all time of the war." You may see the demonstration of the women workers in Petrograd during the February Revolution and Cossack troops joined revolutionary citizens. The second point I'd like to dwell on is the reaction of British official mind and public opinion to revolutionary events in Russia. Surprisingly easy downfall of the Tsardom instigated general euphoria in the Entente states. A lot of contemporaries described an upsurge of great sympathy and enthusiasm towards Russia among ordinary people in Britain who considered the Tsarist regime as a relic of the long bygone feudal era. Suffice it to point to welcome telegrams sent by the heads of 20 major British trade unions to the Russian Provisional Government late in March 1917. They expressed sincere hopes that the revolution would lead to peace without annexations and indemnities, and promote a perfect universal democracy, I quote, all over the world. Meanwhile, the British public launched a discussion about nature of the Russian anti-Tsarist uprising. Some observers compared it with the glorious revolution of 1688 in Britain. Others likened the revolutionary events in Petrograd to the beginning of the anti-royalist movement in England in 1640. Yet most analytics shared the view of left-wing publicists who wrote about obvious resemblance between the overthrow of Nicholas II and the collapse of the absolutist rule of Louis XVI in France in the late 18th century. However, the appeals to Russia's sacred duty to strengthen ranks with its allies in order to successfully win over the Central Empires in the First World War really dominated both political minds and common people. It was this particular topic remaining an issue of the day for the British side, although some prominent politicians became pessimistic immediately after the fall of the Tsarist regime. For example, Lloyd George remarked right after the abdication of Nicholas II, from now on, the Russians, are useless to us in this war. We are coming to the third point. Let me show you another. It was a placard devoted to this period, I mean the spring of 1917. The third point of this presentation concerning modification of British views on Russia as an ally in the First World War. The emerging chaos in the state government, along with the obvious fiasco of the July Kerensky offensive on the Eastern Front, led to the ill-fated mutiny arranged by Commander-in-Chief Lev Kornilov, as we know, in late August, early September 1917. This is provisional government, the first staff of it. Stanley Baldwin, the 3 times prime minister who was skeptical about the possibility of the Russian democratization. And here is Lev Kornilov. This intrepid general desperately strove for the establishment of military dictatorship in Russia, and there is more than a single reliable evidence that given a bitter disappointment in Alexander Kerensky as the national leader and the provisional government's ineffective attempts to consolidate Russia, the British cabinet secretly backed Kornilov's undertaking, though openly attempting to mediate between the Russian general headquarters and Kerensky. Yet the failure of the rebel troops marching to Petrograd compelled London to reaffirm British support for Kerensky, simultaneously demanding more vigorous steps to be taken by the provisional government to continue the coalition war and restrain the Bolsheviks' aspirations for political power. Alexander Kerensky. It was indeed rather difficult for the Entente to regard both internal and foreign policy led by the provisional government as reliable, given the fact that Kerensky and Mikhail Tereshchenko, Mikhail Tereshchenko who took over Russian foreign affairs after Pavel Milyukov in May 1917. So they were wavering between their adherence to the prolongation of the First World War until the ultimate victory, and the demands by many left socialists and by many and by the maximalists, as the Bolsheviks were coined during 1917 in the Entente countries. So it was not a strict and not a solid line pursued by the provisional government, which made it difficult for the British government to find the real policy, the real political course in the Russian question. The last frantic endeavor by Kerensky to improve situation was his proposal to Lloyd George to initiate a peace, to initiate a peace dialogue with Berlin, but on conditions most likely not to be adopted by Germany. As the Russian Prime Minister believed, the most expected refusal on the part of Berlin would help the provisional government to reanimate Russia's military machine in view of the Central Empire's dislike for peace. Hence, as Kerensky mentioned in the message to Lloyd George, the Russian people would have nothing left to do but to fight to complete victory together with their allies. Interestingly, it was William Somerset Maugham, later the famous English novelist, who had been sent on a special secret mission to Russia in August-September 1917, and whom Kerensky had chosen as his messenger to Lord George. And however, when Maugham arrived in London late in November, it was after the Bolshevik coup d'etat and Kerensky's escape, panic escape from Petrograd, so it was too late. My fourth point deals with the impact of the Russian Revolution on the further development of Soviet-Western relations. The news of the Bolsheviks, or Maximalists, as I said, having taken control over Petrograd, did not originally find great response in the United Kingdom. The reasons for these reactions were as follows. First of all, the credibility of the provisional government within and outside Russia had decreased to such an extent by the end of October 1917 that, according to Kerensky's metaphorical expression, the prospect of the Bolsheviks coming to state power merely disturbed foreign embassies. Lenin will reset Kerensky, I quote, "They believe and thereby unwittingly will pave a path for a new, healthy national government which will inevitably come to power in 3 or 4 weeks." On the other hand, according to Lord Robert Cecil, it's Lenin? According to Lord Robert Cecil, who then jointly acted as the Minister of Blockade and Under Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, and later, as we know, was the one of the architects of the League of Nations. Shortly after the Russian November coup d'etat, he, Lord Robert Cecil, asked certain workmen on his estate whether they had any sympathy with the Bolsheviks. And they told him that unless something was done to make another war like the First World War impossible, the Bolshevik system would spread all over the world. And now I'm coming to the conclusion. The 1917 revolutionary events in Russia proved quite unexpected for an overwhelming majority of the British people, regardless of social position or ideology. As one present historian correctly remarked, it was strange, I quote, "It was strange for the average working man that Marx, Engels, Lenin and Trotsky all visited and even lived in England. And some might say England or London was the birthplace of communism." Yet, the downfall of Nicholas II triggered a surge of enthusiasm in all sections of the British society. ranging from industrial workers to the middle class and even aristocrats. It seemed to many liberal and labor leaders that new democratic countries, similarly to revolutionary France a century ago, would certainly not weaken but redouble Russia's military efforts, ensuring the Entente's complete victory of the Central Empires. But the British expectations of Russia's relatively smooth transition from the authoritarian rule to democracy almost evaporated in the fall of 1917. As Kerensky correctly pointed out in his memoirs, I quote, roughly from mid-1917 year, they, the Entente, were determined not to maintain ties with Russia based on friendship and trust until it was governed by a powerful military dictator. In contrast to the March Revolution, in contrast to the March Rebellion in Petrograd, the November upheaval didn't become a surprise to ruling classes in Europe, including those in Britain. Moreover, after the failure of Cornelius' movement, Whitehall attempted to pursue how the British Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Arthur James Balfour, coined it wait-and-see policy, which meant abstention from interference in Russian domestic affairs for the time being. However, the futile attempts of non-Bolshevik forces to return the country to the path of democratic development and the Soviet government embarking on the separate negotiations with Germany early in December 1917 compelled official London to change its Russian policy for the third time during 1917. So we may conclude that the British government changed its policy 3 times during 1917. In the meantime, the most European and British press greatly contributed to the image of Bolshevik leaders as either corrupt agents on paid by Berlin or idealistic fanatics imbued with abhorrence to Britain, which they regarded, I quote Lenin's words, the leader of international financial oligarchy intending to prolong the global carnage for the sake of super profits. Under such circumstances, official recognition of the Bolshevik regime by the British government proved out of question, both on political and even more on moral grounds. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Sergeev. And the next speaker will be Professor Grigoriy Shkundin, also from Russia.
Title: Echoes of the Revolutionary Events in Russia, 1917 in Southeastern Europe.
Шановне панство, ladies and gentlemen, уважаемые дамы и господа, я прежде всего хочу поблагодарить от всей души.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you most cordially. My thanks go to the organizers for having invited me to speak. And the topic is somewhere on the peripheries, the revolutionary events of 1917, so February, October 1917, developments and the impact on the southern and eastern countries of Europe, including Romania, because Romania is not believed to be a Balkan state. And hence the topic of my speech. Yesterday we had a chance to discuss the definition coined by Mr. Burski. The very topic of our conference, the circles of revolution. So a stone is thrown into water in Petersburg, and then the circles spread to the Russian province, to the neighboring states. including Western European countries that were not neighboring Russia but could feel the impact of our revolution. The southern East Europe, with which the Russian Empire was closely linked. So I suggest this particular topic to you. At the beginning of the Russian Revolution in 1917 gave rise to revolutionary processes in the southeastern part of Europe. The socialist and national movements gain new strength. In Russian historiography, the February Revolution was in the shadow of the October Revolution, which is a shame because that February Revolution was an important revolution, and its impact upon the world in general was really a major one. Tsarist Russia transmogrified into the most democratic state on the map of Europe. The proclamation by the Petersburg Council of the rights of the nations for self-determination, it was performed in a legal context, and the fight for freedom without annexations or contributions was reflected in combating states. Not just Romania, Serbia and Greece as allies of Russia, but also inimical Bulgaria. Bulgaria was part of the four-partite alliance. So in all the aforementioned countries, through the status the countries enjoyed in 1917, the reception and the assessment of the developments in Russia was different. After 3 years of war, the fatigue factor made the Russian postulates very popular. Well, the governments were not happy about that. The governments wanted to stand against a revolutionary threat, therefore they demonstrated their commitment to peace and to democratic reform, but nothing of this kind happened. And I'll demonstrate this on the basis of Romania. Now, Romania felt the surge of the February Revolution because in Romania there was 1 million strong Russian army. And then we're also dealing with the so-called Romanian front line. Well, it is Romanian only by name because it was the Russian army fighting there. In December 1916, the Germans entered Bucharest. 2/3 of Romania was actually occupied by the four-partite alliance, and only 1/3 of the land was controlled by the Romanian government. And on that 1/3, the Romanian army was formed. And then the government, parliament, administration, and refugees counted the number of 1 million men. Well, food rationing was operated there, famine took place, but bread was not available even for coupons, for rations. There was also total mobilization. Women and elderly people would work in the fields, but 1/4 of the land lay idle anyway. So if you look at all the problems that Romania was coping with at the time, 70% of children born in 1917 died 1 year later. There were villages that not a single child survived. The government of Amorțianu, I've been researching his life all my life, found a solution: imports from Russia. And this is exactly what happened. On and off, but later the deliveries were discontinued. And so this was the situation in Romania at a time when news came from Petersburg that Tsarist Russia is no longer there. For 6 days, no announcement was made in the press about the abdication of the Tsar. For 6 days, he actually hoped for Tsarist power to be reinstituted. Alexandra Varesco wrote in his diary, "It is a real catastrophe for us, the Russian Revolution, that is. But the illusions enjoyed by the so-called reactionaries came to an end because Bartianu, in early May, visits Petersburg in order to talk with the provisional government about the military relations between the two countries. And he saw all the demonstrations in Petersburg with his own eyes. And he witnessed the fall of Miliukov. He returned to Romania in very low spirits. No military became engaged in the front line. Deputies' councils were being formed. And there was a big demonstration in May in Yassa, the town of Yassa, 15,000. Russian soldiers and Romanian workers would come out with red flags demanding peace without annexations or contributions for the fraternity of the nations. Christian Rakowski was at the time leader of the Socialist Party, and they were not disturbed in the protest action. The military received orders to stay in barracks. It was only plainclothes policemen who remained out there in the streets. There was a secret decision issued not to use firearms against Russians, even if they enter the royal palace. Nasadov informed the Russian council. There were many cases of peasants who refused to work on the landlord's field. According to the Romanian headquarters, in the majority of counties in Romania where Russian troops were stationed, Romanian civilian authorities could not exercise their power and could not really call the populace to public order. Socialists start being active. The revitalized Socialist Party in Yassa starts working. They open clandestine printing houses. They publish leaflets calling for the demise of the monarchy. We are on the eve of major transformations. The Romanian nation can no longer live within the existing regime. The nation needs equality and freedom in order to be able to set up the new order. But the authors of these actions were labeled as spies. And I'll give you a quote. Let the Romanian non-patriotic activists feel those who mess in the heads of our people. Next to Russia, there may not be a despotic state. Down with the Romanian oligarchy. Down with the instigators of pogroms and murders. So the Romanian government in the town of Iași complained about Russian soldiers interfering with Romanian internal affairs. But the impact of that was not unequivocal. We must not simplify the picture. In Romania, Russophobic attitudes did not disappear. As you know, for 30 years, Romania was an ally to the central states, and its relations with Russia were quite cold. Russian attaché in Romania wrote in May 1917, perhaps the intention of our revolutionary troops would not be so acute in its form if Romanians and Russians felt more sympathy and mutual respect, which was simply not there at the time. But it was quite dangerous to toy with the million-strong Russian army. So the Romanian government were also under pressure, and the capital punishment was not to be used. Now, the tribunal of the Fourth Corps of the Romanian army reviewed 7,300 cases of desertion. So the crisis has started to disrupt the Romanian statehood. Two major parties, Liberals and Conservatives. Liberals, headed by Dr. Lupu, set up the Labour Party. And they started to put pressure on the leaders to carry out democratic reforms. But this movement became constrained. It never assumed mass proportions. The activity aimed at revolutionizing Romania had an opposite effect. Obviously, different actions were taken in the army. The Romanian soldiers wanted to return home, but the home was really behind the front line, i.e. on the territory occupied by the Germans. So the only road to freedom was through victory. It was very clear that first they had to liberate their own land and unite all the lands. And there was a lot of support for that in the military and among the public. the leadership of Romania were fully aware that the only instrument against revolution is to carry out social and political reforms. So we can't quite say that they did not consider the reform. They did. However, these reforms did not go beyond the academic classroom. A parliamentary Romanian, while speaking in Romanian parliament, he said the following: without the major developments in Russia, no one would ever contemplate reform. In March 1917, King Ferdinand visited the army and he said, "You are going to receive land, and I'll be the first to set the example." Then, I'm talking about the king, then he visits the army again and promises many different reforms. Now, Parliament very hastily determines the overall shape of the reform. General suffrage, taking land from the hands of landowners. So changing the constitution effectively, which was deemed to be sacrosanct. And certainly these activities had an impact on the general sentiment on the part of the military and the population at large. So if so quickly and without any bloodshed the Romanov dynasty ceased to exist, then the Hohenzollern dynasty can also be removed and we'll proclaim the Republic. Well, on behalf of the Social Democratic Party of Romania, the Committee for the Preparation of Revolution in Romania, that's how the committee was referred to, in 1917, the following point was made: the oligarchs have no more strength. The government is supported by the respect by the general population only, and it will not be a major problem to remove these people from power. And they also talked about exporting revolution. Now, in the conflict between the nation and the elite, the Russian Revolution should play a decisive role. So the Romanian Social Democrats model their activities based on the Russian example. While what they wanted to do was to bring all these big ideals on the red flags. So the revolution should free the people from both external and internal enemies. Well, I will not go into what General Kornilov said in detail. Now, they very much relied on Kornilov. He was expected to introduce death penalty at the front. The Romanians could no longer rely on the support of the Russian army, of Kornilov army. Bačić in Serbia was quite disquieted because the Russian emperor was an ally of Serbia. I remember when Russia joined the war in 1914. So the underpinning power of the Serbian strength was gone. So it was not known what the future would bring. Bačić was unhappy about the prospect of war continuation. Well, he worried that a peace treaty would be signed and that Serbia would be left alone. Pavel Milukov, Russian historian, who was a Bulgarophile, and he believed that the Serbian and Bulgarian issues as regards Macedonia, Bulgarians are right, and Serbs worried that he was going to support Bulgaria. But on March the 24th, 1917, there was a Milukov declaration to the effect that Russia is interested not just in revival of the Serbian state, but also a re-establishment of Great Serbia. Please note that Milukov declaration was the first declaration among the Entente states saying that Serbia should, after the war, unite all the Yugoslav land. So in the early 1917, when France and the Great Britain still wanted to uphold the Habsburg Empire. Now, the second government, Tereshchenko became Minister for Foreign Affairs in the second government, and the agenda of that government was the following. The government undertook to take action to re-establish peace without annexations or contributions. No. Peace without annexation or contribution was difficult for Serbia. Why? Because Serbia wanted to benefit from the popularity of the slogan. It was meaningful because it promised liberation, but at the same time, that would come into conflict with Austro-Hungarian Empire about the land. The February Revolution influenced the Habsburg monarchy, and Charles I was approached in a secret letter. You know what the news is. The Russian Revolution has an impact on our Slavic population. Now, I will not go into the impact of revolution upon Montenegro. Now, Montenegro had been occupied, and emigre community was dominated by Republican sentiment. They did not really see the place for the king after the war. Now, Greece. The February Revolution had an impact on Greece. Greece broke up into two parts, a pro-German government of King Constantine and pro-Entente government by Liderius. Now, I will not be going into all that. These are very interesting diplomatic documents that one could quote. But in Greece, in 1917, Alexander Kerensky was very popular. The Greek newspapers would give the following titles: Kerensky in Russia, Venizelos in Greece. And the Russian councils forgets about the East if Russia does not have aspirations towards Constantinople. Then who would rule Constantinople? Of course, Greece. And Greece, of course, wanted to cash in on this opportunity. And the last point concerning Bulgaria. No. If Tsarist Russia remained in place, Bulgaria would not exist. Bulgarians as a nation proved unable to exist independently, and Bulgarian statehood would disappear. So it was actually planned. Bulgaria were to be split up amongst Entente members. And when that news reached Bulgaria, Ferdinand, who is the Tsar of Bulgaria, decided to withhold the offensive and start contacts with the incumbent government. But later it was declared that Russia will fight until the end, until victory. And it was important to remove some of the huge popularity that Milyukov enjoyed at the time. It was important to weaken it somehow. So the government would try and scare the public opinion that the new Russia, in one way or another, will want to reinsert its presence. And the government media, the government press, would say the following: the eastern part would be annexed in order to provide access to the straits, Bosphorus and Dardanelles. Now, the true Russian democracy removes or perceives the democratic ideal in a different manner than Milyukov did. When Milyukov was removed, the Bulgarians were very happy. And then there was a separatist, and then his attempt at leading Bulgaria out of the war through a separatist peace did not really work. Well, thank you very much, Professor, for your paper.
And now the last lecture by Professor Mariusz Wołos on the French perception of the Russian Revolution and its consequences.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the floor. I will try not to take too much of your time, but let me start with a certain conclusion referring to the title of the book by Professor Włodzimierz Porodziej and Professor Maciej Górny. This is also our revolution, the one that we are talking about. And I don't mean to say that we are supposed to approve it, because we have a rather negative position about the revolution, a different one on the February one and the other one on the Bolshevik revolution. But it's our revolution for two reasons. Well, first of all, according to imprecise estimates, there were from 30 to 50,000 Poles participating directly in the revolution, as many as 50,000, so some of them taking key positions. And secondly, from point of view of certain circles, we are close to the middle, and the revolution has impact on us. It has impact on the Polish cause, on the fate of Poland. It has done so throughout the whole 20th century. So I don't really like the element of Russian historical policy which refers to these events combining both revolutions and the Civil War under the name Великая Русская Революция, imparting it national and ethnic nature. And this is not the way to go. Others were involved as well. So now moving on to the topic of my presentation. French. Luckily for the French, wasn't really under the impact of the outcomes of the revolution, but it had to take position. And I will try to briefly characterize what you probably already know, drawing your attention to certain elements and the events of 1917 and 1918. And I will also discuss the outcomes of the revolutions, the consequences of the revolution in the 1920s and 30s, and the perception back then. Well, you have to take into account two things that determined the approach of the French to the perception of the French to the revolution. And I don't mean here exotics of the Orient, but I mean two very concrete issues. Thing number one was the French-Russian alliance that lasted 25 years. That was the fulfillment of the blackest nightmares. But the alliance also existed during the war, and it was cemented by blood shed by the French and Russian allies. But I am more interested in the fact that the whole generation of people grew up in the shade of this revolution, who will have a great nostalgia about the times of this great alliance. The Russian factor in the East as a barrier counterpart to Germany has been permanently present in the French thinking, regardless whether it's Raymond Poincaré representing central right views, or socialists, or radicals, or colonels of the French army, or generals, or marshals. It's been permanently present, and it's had a permanent impact on the perception of the Soviet Union. And the second issue is money wasted in Russia, money that has been wasted there from the 1980s, before the alliance, before 1918, before this alliance was coined, until 1917, or even until 1914, for that matter. The French had invested in Russian railway, textile industry, all industry branches, even agriculture. They invested 11.3 billion francs in gold. That wasn't the franc from before euro. It was a stable 19th century franc, which meant a lot more. It was a fortune, 11.3 billion. So let me quote another number. In the same time, the French invested only 4 billion francs, golden francs, in their own colonies. So they invested 3 times more in Russia. In 1918, they lost it because of nationalization. They lost a lot, and a lot of people lost. 1.5 million people, businessmen, small ones, bigger ones. Some still hold on to shares of those businesses. They lost the money, and those who and these people had impact on the public opinion, and they have to shape the policy of their country vis-à-vis the Soviet Union. And this is the other factor. So that's the second determining factor. And now I'll try to explain this. Explain my view around these two issues, although the task is not easy as a Polish historian, because my French colleagues have been dealing with these issues for many years now. Andrzej, Sophie Kéré, Fred Kupferman, Nicolas Ver, Sabine Dulin, or the present here, my friend Frédéric Desberg. And I am looking at it from the perspective of a Polish historian. So please bear that in mind. Now, the February Revolution and the overthrowing of the Tsar was perceived by the French, by the majority of the public opinion and decision makers, quite positively, because finally the strange period ended when when a landowner had to stand to attention listening to Marseillaise. Well, and the diplomatic representative Maurice Palolog was replaced by an inexperienced diplomat, non-diplomat Joseph Netlon, mainly related to the Ministry of War and Political Forces. Why did he go there in May 1917? In order to take care of the French business, that's clear. But the most important thing was to make sure that democratizing Russia, to make sure that it stayed on the Entente side. And they succeeded. And that's why the French have a very positive approach to the revolution. But the situation changed dramatically after the Bolsheviks came to power, after the Bolshevik Revolution, when things started happening that were quite disturbing to the French, but not right from the onset, because there was one more very interesting issue. When the Bolsheviks came to power, and there was the idea in the French, on the French side, to send extra 1,000 officers by means of a French mission to Russia to train the allies. Marshal Ferdinand Foch supported that, not because he loved the Bolsheviks, but because he simply wasn't able to accept that Russia would stop being ally of France after more than 20 years of alliance. And what happened? On the 21st of November 1917, Nulon receives a letter from Lev Davidovich Trotsky, whom you know very well, back then the first leader of the diplomacy, Soviet diplomacy, announcing that the Bolshevik government will start negotiations aiming at suspending weapons and, signing the peace without annexations and indemnities and la paix démocratique, democratic peace, whatever it means. Ambassador Nulon comments it in the following way, and here I quote: "Our intention not to disrupt relations with Russia and continue helping it and its cause resulted in the fact that we decided to leave Trotsky's letter unanswered, full stop." And that wasn't the worst thing. Well, the worst thing was that the Bolsheviks did start negotiations in Brest, and this is when these events started to be perceived as a tragedy by the French. Tragedy, which the French ambassador described in the following way. A very emotional way. And again, let me quote: "Those who at the end of war were praising the alliance between France and Soviets," so there were such people, "they had a very short-term memory. They forgot about hundreds of thousands of the deceased, which happened because of the German divisions withdrawn from Russia." As regards myself, I was under incredible impression made by the aid given to our enemies by signatories of the Brest Treaty. I couldn't forgive this betrayal that was swallowed by the government, and it's the government's request that maintained our country in the state of war. And he also heard from an unknown first-ranking French politicians, the following sentence, and I quote: "You misunderstood the idea behind the revolution. And I think Noulon did understand not the idealism, but the cynicism or realism of this revolution. So what happened next? The French know a lot about the revolution itself, and I'm not going to present these issues as in detail as was made by Professor Bruski from the British side, but they are actually present on all fronts of the civil war. The representatives of the French military mission are always there. They write reports, and I guess no one analyzed all the reports until today, until November 1920, when the Whites withdrew from Crimea. And what happened then? Well, I am simplifying things now. I'm not going to talk about Barrière de l'Est, about the political issues. Dichotomy. We have a dichotomy of approach, of perception of the Bolshevik Russia, soon to be Soviet Union. Well, on the one hand, they are the ones who know what's going on inside. They know about murders, about hunger, about peasants' rebellions. And this is peasants' uprisings, and they, well, very few people know about this, only those who read reports and analyze them. And the second perspective is the perspective that I would refer to as idealistic and ideological one. That's a perception of the French left, but I don't mean the communists here. Rather, I mean socialists and central and left forces with a very active party of radical socialists. This is a central left party, contrary to its name. And I will focus on a single person from this party, very influential one, long-term mayor of Lyon, Edouard Herriot, the later Minister of Foreign Affairs in France, Prime Minister, who, whenever he took power in 24 and in 32, led to the tightening of French and Russian relations. Rion, in fall, early for 1922, went on a 40-day visit to Soviet Bolshevik Russia. And on his way in Berlin, he meets the head of diplomacy, Chicherin. They talk on many occasions. And Herriot comes back to France, publishes his book under the famous title La Russie Nouvelle, the New Russia. And in this small book, he's presenting the country, first of all, as a stable one, second of all, as a country that's worth getting interested in, and third of all, he lets his nationals know that maybe a moment will come quite soon when this new Russia, he's not using the name La Russie Soviétique, La Russie Bolsheviste, La Russie Nouvelle. When La Russie Nouvelle will replace the old Russia. So again, they will be our ally against the Germans, in spite of the fact it's already after Rapallo. So that's one area which I'm not going to be dwelling on this because there is a lot of literature about this. It's supported by French activists, including those who happily traveled to the Soviet Union, Alain Laurent, Henri Barbuy, and many others who are thrilled by this country. The fact that Bolsheviks are showing what they want to show them, that's another matter. But that's just one perspective. There's another perspective, which is much more realistic. So in those years, right after revolution, it is represented by Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré, representing central right. And it can be easily translated into a recuperation of debts because the French wanted to get the money back, the money that they just lost. And Poincaré has a very simple philosophy when it comes to Bolsheviks. So we will recognize the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, provided that the Soviet Russia recognizes our debt and starts repaying it. And he never waived this. But his policy in 1923 lost. And that is why another option won, enforced by 1.5 million people who first were waiting for the fall of Russia. White Russia will come and we will regain our money, we will come back to our positions. But then it turned out that this is not going to be the case, that the Bolsheviks indeed were stable. And we have to admit that Eliot was right. So yes, we need to recognize them, but in order to gain the money back. And that's why the Soviet Union was recognized by Eliot in the 30s. I don't want to talk to you about Soviet-French relations right now. Let me move on, looking at the German with anxiety. Let me move on to the later period, namely the beginning of 1930s. And the figure that you, apart from our French friends and Dr. Buchak, will not know, Colonel Mondras, the first attaché of France, military attaché of France. He went there with a very good approach to the Bolsheviks. He spends there very little time, leaves Russia quite quickly, Russia, the Soviet Union, and he writes as follows about the internal affairs, referring to the revolution. There is no doubt that back in 1932-33 in Ukraine, Siberia, Northern Caucasus, there was hunger that Mondras perceives as embarrassing to the main idea of the revolution, namely agricultural collectivization. The French officer was not able to define this phenomenon. He was simply using second-hand information, among others from the Chancellor of the German embassy, Dr. Otto Schiller. Now, without entering into details, he knew perfectly well that there were many thousands of victims, maybe hundreds of thousands of victims. And if you have the impression that the French were naive and did not know that because Ariel went there and he said it wasn't there, you're wrong. They knew full well what was going on and what were the consequences of the revolution. This narrow group did know, and the reports show that. And this goes to show that they were even more cynical in politics, which is quite normal. Let me quote one more opinion, and I'm quite surprised by the fact that the French military attaché focused so much on agriculture. Probably that was his instruction. And here I quote, in 1934, Mondras writes, again, let me repeat that the essential problem in Russia involves the agricultural matter. And he's saying La Russie, and it's not accidental. They often say Russia instead of the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks are trying to solve this matter their way, and they are waiting for the golden age. Right now, people have to satisfy themselves with the catastrophic situation, well, with a slight improvement of the catastrophic situation vis-à-vis next year. The ability of the ruling try to attract peasants. So without them or against them, nothing can be done in Russia, established in Russia. Well, Mondras did not have the same conclusions as we do, that the peasants did not match the Soviet utopia and they had to be liquidated. Well, but this is not to say that he didn't see any problems. And then the 17th session of the All-Russian Bolshevik Party, January, February, well, led to the following words or conclusions. As regards the dictator, the successor of the perfect Lenin, Józef Wissarionovich Stalin, He was, his subordinates were almost religious about him. And there are two issues that he raises as a double communist victory after the revolution. First of all, fight for kolkhoz and the development of the industry. He thinks that in both cases, were failed because the consequence was local hunger, dissatisfaction, separatism, disorganization of transport, bureaucracy, and the development of the apparatus, including the political police, which he describes at length. He's also writing about murders, about 11-year-olds accused of preparing a coup d'etat, for which they were sent to concentration camps, about the fact that prisoners were building some canals, about top-down norms, about norms of sexual life. Well, he has very thorough information about what went on in Gulag, and that was the beginning of 1930s. Why am I saying all this? And here moving on to my conclusions, because we are pressed for time. Two digressions and two conclusions on my part. Please treat them as hypotheses. Thing number one, when it comes to the perception of revolution and its consequences, we are facing two fractions. One is two Frances. One is the specialized France, which knows what's going on there. It's also knowledge about the Great Terror within certain limits available to the Western diplomats. So the famous processes of the Second World War of people who said that there were concentration camps in the Soviet Union, well, it led to a smile on the part of this narrow group, which exactly knew what was going on. And on the other hand, we have a much bigger France, France of the left, the liberal France, which partly pretends that these phenomena do not exist. And the public opinion, not the whole public opinion, there are people who have been contesting this system, but the majority, vast majority, which perceives Russia and, well, perceives Soviet Russia the former ally and is able to forgive a lot, is very forgiving. But there's another digression here, namely, back in the 1920s and at the beginning of 1930s, one can see certain reserve of the French elites and the French society as regards closer contacts with a murderous country. And the French elites knew about this, those which read the report. But back then, in that period, 34, 35, it began to change. So the perception of Russia, of Soviet Russia, was perceived as a totalitarian country with which democracy shouldn't really have any ties. This perception is put to the margin in favor of the perception that such an ally would be very useful. In 1935, France signs Pacte d'Assistance Mutuelle, Pact of Mutual Assistance, but they are not yet signing the military convention. But here, let me put forward the following theory. If we had a different political constellation, if Stalin wasn't really interested in Ribbentrop-Molotov, I'm quite sure that in 1939 France would have signed the military convention and would treat the Soviet ally much better than the Polish ally. I know it's a debatable thesis, so that's it from me, and thank you very much for your attention. Professor, thank you very much. We have more or less time until 1:30. This is the time for our discussion, and I am opening the floor for discussion. You can ask questions, make interventions.
Isabelle Davion, s'il vous plaît.
I have two questions. The first is for Mr. Nowak. I would like to know if you could say a few words about the reception in 1915 of Friedrich Naumann's Mitteleuropa, the publication of this book in Lenin Thoughts, or maybe more broadly in Russia. Thank you. And a question to Mariusz Wołos. Don't you think that in 1924, the earlier mention of the Russian debts is in fact instrumentalized? I mean, I think maybe it's a way to sell the recognition of USSR to the French public opinion. Because 2 years ago they were like these murderers with the knife between the teeth, and they were the objective allies of Germany in Rapallo, and out of a sudden we have to make a security pact with them. So maybe this reference to the I want my money back would be a way in fact to sell this diplomatic move to the French public opinion, saying I have your interests in mind, and etc.
Thank you very much. Frédéric Desbert, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much for your 4 very brilliant lectures. Same person for the question. My first question to Professor Nowak. Do you know if there was any Soviet reaction or perception of the theory of Asianism that was born among the Russian emigre circles in Prague, Paris, and so on in the first part of the 20s? And to Mariusz, I wanted to congratulate him for his lecture that showed that the French-German obsession was always present in the French-Soviet relation and Franco-Russian relation. And my question is, what part do you put of the bad memories of the French-Russian alliance in the way that a French perception was that the slaughter of the First World War has been partly caused because France had to follow Russia into war, and that made difficult another military alliance which had been preferable maybe until 1939.
Kto jeszcze?
Yes, please. Yes, I also have a question to Professor Nowak. When we talk about influence over Lenin, well, there are Marxists, Malinovsky, Bogdanov. They talked about the possibility of a war between socialist states, which is very interesting for the then current socialists. How did that impact Lenin? Was there any dialogue, any exchange about that? Yes, please. Eva Hovko, I have a question to Professor Shkundin. To what extent the historical memory that Russians were the liberators and co-founders of the Bulgarian state, and for Romania, the Russians actually occupied part of Romania, because Eastern Moldova, Romania always treated as its own eastern flank, Bessarabia and Moldova now, because Bessarabia includes Odessa too. Now, to what extent this historical memory, completely contrary to the experience of the First World War, came to a clash in the two countries, because Romanians believed Russia was their ally, and Bulgarians had Russia as an opponent. Thank you, Dr. Buchak. I would like to comment in a couple of sentences about the very interesting conclusion of Professor Wołos' paper. Now, setting aside what her friends presented, Madame Davion and Monsieur Desper, who handle Polish-French relations, and they understand perfectly well the Polish historiography and the Polish positions there. But to me, a very drastic example of how the very important milieu reacted at a time when the Second World War was approaching, when the French were surprised, and you can see that in many different narratives, and they were actually scandalized that the Poles resist being sucked into this French-Soviet-Polish alliance, which could have prevented German aggression. So then the issue of allowing a passage to the Soviet troops, two passages in fact, Galician and Northern, opening it. Well, this I find very disappointing. I think General Wolford said when he returned from Moscow to Warsaw in August, and he was received here by General Stachewicz, who was chief of staff at the time, who later, in his memoirs, said that Poles actually rejected this very good, the only possible combination, which would have been an agreement to create passages for the Soviet troops across Poland. Now, there is a misunderstanding of what at that time, what could have been and what was Soviet Union at that time vis-à-vis Poland, the capitalist Poland. It was hated by Moscow. Well, this perspective does not seem to be seen by some French influential circles at the time, of the time. Well, that was the last question. I will take the liberty of giving myself the floor and ask the question. Professor Nowak's paper. Now, to what extent Lenin, in his writing, reflect his knowledge of the classics of political thought, including Mackinder and other important works? Isabelle Davion asked about Mitteleuropa and Neumann. And a question to Professor Sergeev. In Poland, in the Polish debate, many times it was considered what were the reasons behind the declaration of March 1920. Professor Vendich actually devoted an article to the question to what degree Buchanan's intervention was instrumental or not. Professor Paweł Milukov denied that a few times, actually. Could you please comment? And Professor Wołos' paper, very briefly, the interest in Soviet agriculture at a time of collectivization was not a characteristic of the French or German embassies, but also the Polish one. In Poland, a lot of attention was given to that by ambassadors Łukasiewicz and Grzybowski, beyond any proportion, in fact. Now, to the best of my knowledge of the French political thought in the interwar period, well, I think it shared a deep conviction that the approximation between Berlin and Moscow was possible. You can see it coming up in French diplomatic documents of the time. So, you know, my respect to the French diplomatic thought, because that was a realistic approach. However, expecting Poland to be part of the balancing policy in the 30s was out of the question, was in fact irrational. Now, had Stalin not oriented himself towards Berlin, maybe French, British, Soviet military convention would have been signed, yes, but it would have remained a sheet of paper. Nobody would have forced Poles at the time to let the Red Army into the Polish territory. Well, thank you very much for the 4 extremely interesting questions. Two of them I can actually collapse into one. Now, it was not the intention of my paper to say that Lenin was somehow inspired by Bahan or Mackinder or Hielen or Neumann mentioned by you, madam. Well, the point was that Lenin wanted to make out of geopolitics an instrument of Bolshevism. And at the end of the day, he made Bolshevism an instrument of geopolitics. Now, what did he read? He read Social Democrats, Russian, German. He would engage in a heated polemic with them. It took a lot of his time. His free time he devoted to a major review which he effected between 1914 and 16. He actually reviewed his earlier position on Marx. He would read Aristotle, Feuerbach, and Hegel. A lot of philosophy he read at the time, which, coupled with his practical experience, would convince him that it is not Marxist theory which is sacrosanct, but it is the practice which is the test of fire. Now, reading Naumann or Mackinder, he simply did not have the time for that. He could have heard of them, but in his bibliographies you will not find these names. He could have known them reading Russian or German papers because they were widely discussed at the time. Now, your question, Professor Desberg, reaction to reception of Eurasianism. Now, the Politburo of the Bolshevik Party would look closely at the speeches given by Eurasianists since 1920s. That is when the movement became more entrenched, especially in 1921 and 22. Bolshevik leaders speak in unison about that. Now, that this is very beneficial to us, they said, these are useful idiots, to use the term coined by the Italian communist, because it would split up Russian emigre communities. Some of them we can convince to step over to our side. So, yes, this movement will actually split up Russian emigre as a political opponent. Ustriel, for example, who really stemmed from the same root as Eurasianists. Professor Kołornicki's question, did Lenin refer to Bogdanov's theory that socialist or communist countries can one day actually take up arms against one another? I think this is the difference between Lenin and Stalin. Lenin, indeed, was the enemy of the Russian chauvinism, great Russian chauvinism, as Lenin put it. And while presenting his visions for the future, that first there'll be a socialism in one country, then in a couple of countries, but once socialism is established in a country more advanced than Russia, then Russia will be the backwater country. It will be subordinated. There would be no war for leadership. It will be decided by the maturity of the production capacity of the proletariat. But then, of course, Stalin had a different view as regards Russia as the cradle of the revolution. Stalin believed the war for leadership and socialism was a possibility, but not for Lenin.
So the question of Professor Kornat, and maybe a few comments on some other questions. So the British ambassador's intervention in the revolutionary process. You know, this, it was a legend coined by, firstly, by the German propaganda, and then used by the Bolsheviks themselves. In fact, it was maybe this myth was used for in the British propaganda, and we may say for certain that Buchanan supported the Kornilov's uprising and even sponsored and even subsided, financially subsided, because this movement, because there is information that Buchanan gave money to print, to publish Kornilov's appeals, brochures to all the Russians, and to those troops which were under the command of the original government, provisional government. So it was the fact that we may consider for certain. And besides, the British government, the idea of the British government was to send a substantial, maybe ambassador, I mean, Mr. Henderson, who arrived in Russia in the summer of 1917, and it was the idea, it was a plan to supplement somehow Buchanan, who was, of course, considered by the Petrograd Council as an old-fashioned diplomat and not suitable for the situation. And as we know, Buchanan left Petrograd early in January 1918, and was supplemented by Robert Bruce Lockhart, who was more convenient to Bolsheviks, and who began all these negotiations to reintegrate the Eastern Front, to renovate the Russian army, and to mobilize, maybe to restore this front, and to continue the Great War in the ranks of the Entente. And maybe three short comments, just to not to. Just to let my colleagues speak also. It seems to me that the split between France and Britain concerning the situation in this diplomatic sphere, the split between France and Britain began after the Soviet-Polish War, and after the Turkish-Greece War of 1922-1923, 1921-1922, this split was quite visible, and the contradictions became very clear. So, in 1924, Britain was the first, as we know, to recognize the Soviet government. The Soviet government officially recognized the Soviet government. France was the second, and France had nothing to do but to follow Britain in this diplomatic move. And to, because though you are right, of course, Professor Wołos, that the interests of British shareholders were much less than the interests of the French, because the French shareholders of Russian debts, they were about 1,600,000, and British much less. And about Mackinder, maybe a commentary. Halford Mackinder arrived in Russia on a secret mission and was sent to the Denikin government, as we know, and participated in the British military mission staged, accredited the Denikin's headquarters. And his idea was to establish the so-called Southeastern Union in the south of Russia, including the Cossacks regions, Ukraine, the Crimea, and so on. And about the turn to the east and Lenin and Stalin's ideas, you see, after the Soviet-Polish War, it was Zinoviev and Radek, Grigoriy Zinoviev, Karl Radek, who arranged the Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku. And it was in this place where this first move, or this first intention was articulated. It's very important to know.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Shkundin, 3 minutes, please. Possible.
Мне был задан только один вопрос об исторической.
Well, a question was asked to me about historical memory. Now, talking about Bulgaria, as you know, everything really depended on personal relations between the monarchs. Say, Alexander III hated Bulgaria, and Bulgarian Tsar, who was his brother. So his attitude towards Bulgaria was towards a provincial town somewhere behind the line of Danube. And then it was said that, yes, Russian soldiers liberated us from the Turkish rule, but who is now going to liberate us from the Russian rule? Nevertheless, in the years of the First World War and during the Second World War, when Bulgaria was an ally of Germany and then of the Third Reich, during the First World War, Tsar liberated Bulgaria. Alexander III now has a monument in Sofia downtown. But during the Second World War, the monument was not demolished, but it was covered. Now, in Bulgarian literature, it is said, I mean, do we really have to celebrate March the 3rd as an official holiday, which is the San Stefansky Pact signature date? And that was the achievement, I mean, the establishment of the Bulgarian state was the achievement of Russian democracy. And they suggest September the 22nd, when Bulgaria proclaimed independence of the Ottoman Empire. And Bulgarians did it single-handedly without the help of Russia, and I believe it should be celebrated. Now, Romania. Well, it was an haphazard, an accidental ally under the pressure of France. Because France did put pressure for concessions to be given to Russia. Yes, we are allies. We close our eyes, we clench our teeth, we close our ears, and yes, we are allies. But they do not want to be the ally of Romania. Russia did not want to be an ally of Romania, but France put her foot down. There's a 100th anniversary of Marashesh of 1970. Without any Russian help, Romanian army scored this victory independently. And if it is believed that the First World War and the alliance with Romania was by and large uncomfortable for Russia, and to some degree it led to revolutionary process, then the Second World War, the establishment of the great Romania Mare, Romania was looking at this problem, at this issue, and promoting it. Well, please do not worry, I'm not going to take away lunch from you, but if I were to get engaged fully, I would probably have to deprive you of both lunch and dinner. Now, Professor Davion put a question. The recognition back in 1924 and the public opinion, well, there was no need to take any special actions by the French diplomacy to convince the French public, because they were all in agreement. The Soviet Union should be recognized. And that recognition came from communist circles, because then they would be happy to see Commissar, and Commissar did come, and Moderator as well. I mean, moderates. It was only right and extreme right political forces, Action Française, Charmoraz, evidently they did stand against. But why was there support? Because they wanted to get their money back. Secondly, the Soviet Union had already been recognized by Great Britain and Italy. Countries were lining up to enter the market. France did not want to be left behind. Now, these developments were worrisome to Poland, but that was mentioned in the discussion. The British formula was applied to recognize the Soviet Union, according to which the Soviet government will be recognized in the areas that recognize the Soviet rule. And then there was a mention of the plebiscite in the eastern borderland of Poland. As was the case in Locarno, we did not want to spike the guns of our ally in shaping France's relations with the Soviets. Obviously, sometime later, the situation was different. Now, as a little rebuttal to colleagues, I agree, it was just a sheet of paper, and I do apologize for being slightly iffy. Indeed, historians have problems with facts and theories, and if they think they can afford to be iffy, hypothetical about things, then this is adding insult to injury. Of course, Poland would have never agreed to let the Soviet army pass through. It was simply completely unrealistic. Henryk Buchak suggests, indeed, the French seem to understand the Soviets better than their own ally, which is Poland, at least some of the French. But there is another point here, and I would like to make a mention of it, if only in one sentence. Were there any political forces, influential ones, that were in favor of the Riga borders? No, there were no such political forces in France. Even Marshal Foch believed that these frontiers are moved too far to the east. And the same belief was held, even if not spoken out loud, by all the French politicians. He could not simply understand otherwise. And for us, these are considerations of utmost importance, to give away the eastern borderlands of Poland. Even if the French actually recognized the border in 1923, it doesn't immediately follow that they would want to fight for it. Not at all. Now, being hypothetical, being iffy, why would the alliance French-Soviet be possible? Comment se veut-il? That is exactly the point. It is essential to save peace, not only here, but also in the Soviet East. So this is not something that, this is an appeasement policy. This is saving peace. Also, vis-à-vis the Soviet Union, Professor Nowak actually wrote about that with respect to 1920. But the same reference can be made to 1930. If the French saw in the military pact signed a possibility to save peace, they would have signed it. They would have signed it, but I fully agree with my colleague here, Mr. Kornat, that that would have been only a sheet of paper, because Józef Beck would never have agreed to that. I think we are making inroads into another conference when in 2019 there will be an anniversary of the beginning of the Second World War.